Good evening, everyone. This is Shane Gebauer with BrushyMtnBeeFarm. Thank you for your patience and our slight delay in getting started. Just a little bit of technology issues there, but I think we've got them resolved. This evening we've got Dr. Larry Connor with us talking about 2.5 hives. Larry is a well-traveled, well-written, well-read individual. He's written several books, of which tonight's talk is based on much of the information in those books, which I'm sure Larry will expound upon here in just a few minutes. This is one in a series of webinars that I'm going to be doing with Larry, so we'll discuss that as well, so there'll be an opportunity to come back and hear some of the other information that he's got. I don't want to take too much time here since we did get a bit of a late start, and I'm going to turn it right over to Larry. Larry, thanks for being with us. I appreciate it. And go ahead, take it away. And just before you do that, just I'll launch those polls on your cue, Larry, the two questions that we've got.
Hello, everybody.
Larry, we're having a terrible time hearing you.
Okay.
Are you there still?
I am.
Okay.
I don't know what to say.
Well, we've got you now.
That's about it. You want to go to the telephone?
Maybe give that a try. Stay connected here and see if you can't dial in. I'm sorry, folks, but technology, it's a wonderful thing when it's working well, but sometimes there's some hiccups.
I'm getting the fact that your office is closed. You're going to have to call me.
Let's see here. Let me pull up you wouldn't be dialing into me. You'd be dialing into the webinar, and I've got to just quickly get that phone number. So the phone number that's going to be my dial-in number. Sorry, folks. The phone number is going to be unique to you, Larry.
Okay.
And it's in the email that you used to connect to the webinar. Do you have that handy?
Not anymore.
I just tried to send it again. It's going to be, because if I give you mine, it's going to connect you as me, and then that's going to create some problems. We've got you right now. The sound quality seems to be pretty good.
All right, let me just see if I can continue in this
Okay.
and then see where we go. All right?
Okay. Yeah.
I gotta get back to where we were. All right, so what are we talking about when I talk about 2.5 hives, and what kind of discussion are we going to have this evening? It's really fairly simple. I like the idea of establishing 2 hives for both new and experienced beekeepers rather than just one, for a couple of reasons. And then, and we'll get into that. And then I want to keep one or more nuclei, or nukes, available for backup. And they're backup for queen loss, for problems you have with varroa, for queen replacement, adding resistant stock, or anything of that sort. this whole idea comes from a result of one of those surveys that many of you participated in, and it indicated that, excuse me, the beekeepers that only keep one hive are losing nearly 60% of their hives every year, probably during the winter. And that doesn't make any difference whether you're a new beekeeper just starting out or if you're fairly experienced with bees. And I think most of you probably understand that one reason people quit beekeeping is the fact that, you know, if the colony dies, they're going to get a little frustrated and say, I'm not going to put more money into it. The bees are dead. I guess they're trying to tell me something. So why 2 hives? Well, you can have more than 2, but 2 is the minimum number we can work with here, that you can make up some of the losses that you get when you have one that drops out for reasons we'll discuss. And with a 2-colony beekeeper, I find that you tend to be more focused. You got more money involved, of course. You've got more time, hopefully, involved in study and research on what's involved. And there's a faster learning curve. And when I say that, what I'm talking about is the fact that when you observe 2 colonies, or more than 2, you see more beekeeping than if you just have 1 hive. And I've always made the point with new beekeepers that what happens to them may not be what's happening to the guy next to them in the bee class. So having more than 2 colonies is an advantage and duplicates some of the things you get with group beekeeping, which not many of us get to do. I'm not too sure we all want to do that. So how do 2 colonies help each other? Well, first of all, we've got, no, come on, slide, the opportunity to equalize bees, brood, and honey. And if you have some traditional beekeepers, they spend a lot of time equalizing the number of frames of bees or the number of frames of brood in their hives so that everybody got the same amount of honey or would get the same pollination fee. And so you'd move frames of brood from one colony to another, and people say, well, don't sting and so forth, and fight each other and kill each other. And the general answer is when you're moving nurse bees, you don't have any problem. So you can move bees around, you can move brood around, you can move frames of honey around. So that whole aspect of equalization is a big one. I don't know why it's flipping upside down, but it doesn't do it very much. That source of brood, if you have 2 colonies and you lose a queen in one colony, then you've got a chance of saving that queenless colony with brood from the second colony. And that provides a real incentive, and I think that's the key to this whole aspect of 2 and Half hives. So you have these, you have brood for a nuke, you can make up a new colony, and it help your operation is going to benefit, and because you're going to know a little bit more about why queens fail, when they fail, and some of the things that are involved in queen replacement. So as you look at a colony, here's a beekeeper out toward Lake Michigan. He's got 2 hives of bees on a friend's property. And you look at it and get a little philosophical here just for a minute. That our perception is that if we look at all the different parts of what's going on in beekeeping, we understand the whole a little bit better. So if we learn components of beekeeping, there's a better chance you're going to succeed. So it's a compilation of mastering all the tools, the steps of management, understanding the biology, and that's all going to help your beekeeping. So in a way, it's like a gestalt beekeeping, or is it? I'm not really sure, but it's a kind of a getting hit over the hammer with all kinds of things. You learn a lot more with 2 colonies. So here's a beekeeper that set up 2 hives and made up 2 nukes instead of 1. So he's got 3 hives, but in 4 boxes, if you will. So he's wintered these bees, and he did pretty well with them, but he was a brand new beekeeper. With 2 hives, he produced 2 nukes, and he got them through the winter. So let's look at an example of what this 2-colony management scheme may look like. First of all, many of us start out with packaged bees, and there are good things and bad things to be said about packaged colonies, but one of the problems I've seen over the last certainly 10 years has been the number of beekeepers who get packages who fail. And the reason they fail quite often has something to do with the queen bee. So if you get 2 packages and one of those queens fail, you look at the colony, and this happens to be older comb, but you don't see any eggs, you don't see any larvae, and of course you have that sinking feeling that, oh Lordy, what have I got to do now? If you have another colony available, then you walk over to that other colony and find a frame of brood with eggs and larvae, and you can, if there's enough bees in the queenless colony, you don't have to add the bees to it. You just brush those bees off really gently and put that frame with brood so they can make their own queen. And this isn't a really good slide, but it shows some emergency queen cells that have been constructed from a frame that you've added and made queenless. You can also equalize these colonies in strength. If one package colony gets, any colony gets really strong, you can just reverse the 2 locations. So you know, if you have a red hive and a blue hive, you just swap their locations and let the field force from the stronger colony reinforce or boost the colony that's weaker. And so this is a way of an easy way of doing it with new colonies in single boxes. They're pretty easy to pick up. Just remember to get the bottom board when you do it. If you have a helper that can help you move them, if you have any weight issues or trying to move these things, swapping the site can be a really effective way of equalizing. Also, as the colonies grow, if one colony is doing a little bit better with honey reserves, I would include pollen in there as well, you can equalize those as well. So this gives you the ability for kind of averaging it out. You have 2 colonies, you try to keep them on an even keel. And after a couple of months, let's say you get your packages in April, May, June, sometime late June, early July, 4th of July weekend, you got a long weekend and nothing to do. You're trying to get away from your husband or your wife or your kids or whoever it is in your life that makes you crazy. And so you run out to the bee yard and you decide you're going to make a nucleus. You've got the equipment and you're going to try it. So you're going to set up a new colony, and you're going to look in at one of your colonies and look for a nice frame of sealed brood with probably some open brood on it, the bees on it, some food on it, and you're going to put that in that nucleus colony. And if you have a queen available that you purchased from somewhere, and this may determine what you're doing, that's really good. A purchased mated queen is the fastest way of getting this nucleus started. And if she happens to be from a stock that is resistant to tracheomites and to varroa mites and whatever else you want to look for, that'd be a really cool thing for you to work on. So certainly with varroa mite resistance or tolerance, probably a more accurate term, it's a nice thing to do. So you put that queen in there and you install her with this nuke. You're going to add shakes of bees if you have to. Make sure you don't add the queen from either of the parent colonies. Now, here's the big thing. You can combine frames of brood and honey from both colonies to make up this new colony. Both colonies can contribute. One's got a little bit more honey, the other one's got a little more brood. You take the bees from both. And you say, well, Dr. Connor, isn't that going to cause these bees to fight? And if all things are equal, you're not going to see any fighting. And if you have any questions at all, you can always bounce the bees in front of this new hive. The nurse bees go in, the field bees fly home, and you have nobody there but nice young bees. And now restrict your entrance so they won't be robbed out. That's huge. And make sure you have enough bees in there that you don't have a problem with small hive beetles, because I know a lot of you are dealing with those nasty little beasts. So you want a strong colony. This is an 8-frame colony. I would prefer to use a split 10-frame or a split 8-frame, or use a 5-frame nuke box. But you can use any size colony you want to in these operations. So in that nuke, you're going to put in a mite-tolerant queen, and you're going to keep that queen in there in reserve. So if one of those package colonies, or one of those, if you bought nukes in the spring, or if you bought overwintered colonies, if you had overwintered colonies, you now have a spare queen in reserve that you can combine into a colony without a great deal of fuss and bother. And of course, one of the things this implies is here that, you know, you're going to have to step up and do this. You're not going to, you know, just wish it done. You have to go to, you know, suit up, get the smoker going, and go out and do whatever has to be done so these bees make it. So now you've got a queen reserve, and once you know, go in and it's August, and if you've had maybe you got a swarm or two during the season, and that old queen in the swarm has died, or maybe you had a package or a nuke where the old queen has disappeared, and you may have had an issue with poor mating. You may have had an issue with dragonflies or kingbirds or some other predator picking off that queen on her mating flight. So you now have a laying queen that you can use to replace that queen that's failed in her normal procedure in queen replacement. So you've got a step ahead, and you can also save those bees time during maybe the slower time of the season, depending on where you are, or during and after the nectar flow, if you're in a northern state and you want to try to get these bees boosted. So you can just simply move the frames of brood and bees right into that box, and I know that's the same hive I showed you before, but you can pretend with me, can't you? So it's a way of doing some equalization, having a little fun with your bees, and keeping your colony count higher. And that's going to lead to more productivity. It's going to lead to a little more logical management, I think. And you're going to see a lot more beekeeping by doing this. So what happens if you don't lose any bees? I've always thought that one of the real curses that beekeepers have is, you know, they've been too successful. And so they've got 2 hives, and now they've got 2 nukes, and all 4 colonies get through the winter. Well, there are various methods that you can use to combine these hives in the spring. You could sell the nukes. You could do a 2-queen system, so you don't have to grow the operation past what you want, or you might gift these bees to somebody that you like that really wants to get started with bees, and now you're the mentor. Well, one of the things I think is really pretty cool is the fact that a lot of people are overwintering nukes now. This didn't used to be the case. Here's a great shot from Aaron Forbes up in Maine, and they've got 2 3-box nukes side by side, strapped together on top of a regular hive. So there are 3 hives there, 3 queens there. And why do you do that? Why would you set them up on top of the other? Well, the 2 colonies side by side, they're sort of sharing each other's heat, even though it's through wood. And the colony down below is sharing some heat with the top colonies. And so you have this little thermal cluster phenomenon going on. And that really does a good job of providing a little incentive for those smaller colonies, or excuse me, the physiological aspects of those smaller colonies to get through the winter. So I'm kind of encouraged by this sort of thing. You see all sorts of variations of this. Here's an operation in New York State where the colonies are in double nuke boxes. This is a 10-frame. Is it a 10-frame? I can't count all the way. 8 or 10-frame boxes with a divider down the middle, 2 nukes side by side, probably 2 deeps, but could be 3 medians, and then packed with straw in a case. Now, that's not going to be appropriate for where you are, Shane, there in North Carolina. But if you're up in northern Michigan or northern Vermont, this might be something you want to play with. The big thing here, of course, is watching out for those blasted mice. Hay or straw or leaves, that is also going to provide insulation. It's also going to provide some moisture collection when those colonies get booming there. Notice there's an insulation board there on that he's lifting up. So this is a way of thinking about wintering your bees. Here are a couple of colonies that Mike Palmer in Vermont uses, and they can be 2 nukes that are wintering side by side. They could be on top of another colony, much like Aaron Forbes' operation, but 2 queens, 2 separate boxes divided by a piece of wood, follower board type situation, and that would then give you the ability to winter these nukes with a little more energy efficiency than wintering them by themselves. you can't do that. You can winter by yourself as well. Well, some of these concepts are in my newest book on Bee Essentials, a field guide, and I just want to kind of wrap this up a little bit, and then we're going to open it up to questions, if that's all right, Shane. Considerations that we want to think about. I think that because if you have to make the investment to buy a second beehive, the equipment and the bees, and or expand to another operation, that those new colonies, you ought to think, I'm going to let those bees keep any honey they produce. You know, I'm not going to be too ambitious about taking that honey off, and that gets you off the hook and buying an extractor and so forth. You'll do that next year if you're successful with this, and that's what we really want to do, is try to increase some success here. You can use those nukes or any extra colonies you've got to grow your operation, which I know a lot of people end up doing. They keep them, and then they grow for more, or they sell those nukes. And I don't know what a nuke sells for in your area, but I've seen overwintered nukes, not spring nukes that are made up in the spring. I've seen overwintered nukes selling in the $200 to $300 range, as much as overwintered colonies. And of course, you have to really focus on keep everything healthy and mite-free. So no diseases, no fall brood. Minimize your chalk brood. Keep the varroa mites under control. All of these things have to happen. And that's going to help you really enjoy those bees. So you can go out and have an afternoon martini watching the bees fly in and out of your 2 or 3 hives that you've got. So with that, I'm just going to throw my address and contact information up there. I'm pretty good at answering emails, but when I'm at deadline, which I am right now, I tend to give really short answers. Yes, no, or maybe will be the answer that you get. But you can also go to my website and explore that a little bit. We've got some other webinars. I'm just going to go through this real quick here. In March, we're going to talk about making nukes, which is somewhat based on my book on increases essentials. In the end of March, we're having a program here in Michigan for those here in the Great Lakes area on beekeeping for fun and profit, a day-long program at one of our food-friendly, local food-friendly restaurants, Food Dance here in Kalamazoo. In April, we'll have a webinar on queen management. And in May, we're going to talk about bee biology, a little bit of anatomy thrown in. That's a promise from this new book by Ian Stell. He's an ER doctor in London who I've just been able to get some copies of his book in. Finally, just the last of the advertisement, I hope, is this new reprint we've done on the history of American beekeeping. So with that, Shane, let's open it up to questions.
All right. Thank you, Larry. I appreciate it. We do have some coming in. We've got there's 2 questions here that are similar. One says, can you winter a medium 5-frame nuke, and how much stores will you need? And then along those same lines, how much honey stores should a 5-frame nuke have to get through winter? And this particular person is in New York.
Well, I think anytime you're wintering a colony, you want to have as much honey in that box as you can get, and as many boxes as you have available. So if you have a medium 5-frame nuke box, it would be better if you had 2 mediums. So you got 10 medium frames, and that top box should be just filled with honey, and the lower box where the bees are, when you go into winter, they should probably be about 80% honey, 75–80% honey. We're not going to count cells here. You're going to have to use your experience. Some people have experimented with insulation for these nukes, as you saw in those pictures. Some are using polystyrene and insulation boards and so forth. I think there's probably some reason for further research on that. But basically, the more honey you leave with those bees, the better off you're going to be. Now, if you're wintering any colony with 8 or 10 frames, you really want that lower box to be pretty well filled, but you want a second box for the bees to move up. And the work that I've done myself on wintering nukes, the more you have space for the bees to move up, that one slide from Aaron Forbes with 3 boxes, that tells me that they've found it there where they are in Maine, that they need that or benefit for having that 3rd box, because the bees, of course, they kind of evolved to go in a narrow cavity like a tree. So they're moving up in that chimney-like arrangement. So it's easier for them to move up into that warmer honey as the heat rises. They're moving over until they get to the very top. And if you have insulation and moisture control, then they should be able to go out across the tops of the frames. So I don't know if that answered the questions all completely, but that's kind of a quick take on it.
I think it touched on it, absolutely. There's questions are moving around. Here's a question. Now, this question gets to the whole topic of this webinar, I think, because this particular person, they started off with 2 hives going into winter, and 1 didn't make it, right? And so I think that the point that you're trying to make here is that by having 2 and a half, you've got that extra half that you can sort of reestablish that second one. But they don't, and so now they're wondering, how can they reestablish that second hive without having to purchase a package?
Well, depending on where they are, they probably aren't going to be doing anything today or tomorrow. I got 7 degrees forecast and lake effect snow, so we're not going to do too much for the bees in the next 48 hours at least. We have had breaks in the weather, temperatures up in the 50s, and that's still too cool to do any splitting. You want to keep that colony you've got alive right now, because between the end of February to sometime in April, that's when most of your colonies die. And it's because they're running out of food. It's also because, well, the reason they run out of food is that they're rapidly growing. They've got that kick in the butt from the increasing day length. The queen is laying more and more eggs every day if they've got the food reserves. And so you have a larger and larger brood nest that has to be fed. You have more bees that have to be fed. And so now is the time that you want to get out there with the, depending again where you are, in the southern states you certainly could use a sugar syrup. You probably have maples in bloom in Georgia and other states along that latitude. And
they're blooming in North Carolina now, right outside of my window.
So, and we could have that here in a couple of weeks here in Michigan. So that's the kind of thing that, things change very rapidly at this time of year. When we go from February to March to April, it's a tremendous change. If you look at your change in day length, that boost from photoperiod, you have got to be out there ready to feed. And I have some issues with people that don't feed and let their bees starve. They say, well, that's natural beekeeping, and I'm thinking, well, for the lack of a 5 or 10 pounds of sugar in sugar syrup, they could have kept those bees going and not lost them, and they had them around, because once the pollen starts in nature, it's that sugar syrup that stimulates them to get the brood going. So I'm not too sure where I was going with all this, but you've got to do some careful watching and careful feeding, and this is not the time to be a laid-back beekeeper. I know. Go back to that single colony that's wintered. You want to make plans for splitting it probably sometime mid-spring.
They were in Maine.
Pardon?
They were in Maine.
In Maine, all right. Well, Maine, I think spring arrives sometime in July, right?
And winter comes in August.
Yeah. Well, it's not quite that bad,
No.
but I would suggest that they look for a local queen source, get a queen lined up to replace it, and then work with somebody that they know, contact Aaron Forbes or somebody up there who will, unless it's Aaron who's calling, and then try to get this colony in shape, build up, plenty of food, really strong brood nest. Instead of letting it swarm, you split it, or you take a nuke out of it. You make a divide. Whatever terminology you want to use, you're taking bees away from that colony, and whether you take the old queen with the new colony or leave the old queen behind, doesn't make any difference. It's like a swarm. It can work both ways. And so you end up trying to do what you can to end up with those 2 colonies and then repopulate that hive that died out. Now, what I would do, and once that colony starts booming or growing this spring, if you have any food reserves in the dead-out colony, I'd set that on top and let those bees get in there. Clean it out. Make sure all the dead bees are gone, so you've got nice clean equipment. You don't have moldy old comb. And I know people sometimes say, oh, it's so disgusting, I burned it. Well, that's waste. That's very wasteful. You can use that colony that has died as long as it's not due to American foul brood or pesticide contamination, which probably is not the case in Maine. And then you have a good chance of getting 2 good colonies going next year. And then both colonies should produce a crop of honey if all things are equal. That should do it. Excellent.
There are 2 questions here that I think go hand in hand. One is if you're considering overwintering nukes, when do you suggest making up those nukes? And of course, there's going to be some variation depending on whether you're in Florida versus Maine. And then also, what considerations do you need to be prepared for? What do you need to be prepared for to make sure that those nukes don't outgrow themselves and swarm? What sort of things are you looking for there?
Well, I have to admit that last year some of my nukes swarmed when I was out visiting my family in Alaska, so I'm no one to preach on this one. You can make up a nuke too strong. I did that in June, and they were swarming in July. You have to monitor your nukes just like you do any colony. The smaller the colony is, you want to check and make sure that they're not booming out too fast. You can take frames of brood and bees out of a nuke and make up more nukes, and many people do that on a regular basis. And I know some of you don't want to have that many nukes, but it's a great way of growing your bee operation if you want to do that. You can always add frames of brood back to that colony, your 2 original colonies, and boost their population so that they make more honey. Now, when to make up a nuke? Well, that's a $64 question. I noticed the last year that here in Kalamazoo that we had a shortage of drones in August, and kind of shut down on drone production. So any attempt to get natural mated queens in August ended up with some colonies that had laying workers. Well, that's not very productive, and it's pretty frustrating because a colony with laying workers is probably one of the most difficult ones to get reestablished. So you want to avoid that if you can, or you just combine that colony with one of the other colonies and say, I'm done with it for the season. We use a newspaper method, and that's fine. So I would like to suggest that most people try to make their nukes up while there's still a nectar flow underway. Maybe not during the key part of the flow. If you're like most of us, you have a swarm season here in Michigan in, let's say, late April through early June. And maybe sometime there in May, mid-May, late May, we make up our nukes and we have them growing during the nectar flow. They add weight, especially if you're a new beekeeper and you have no choice but use foundation, or not, you're letting them build natural comb. Well, this is a good time for them to grow up. So I think that that's a logical thing to do. I've got friends that make nukes up in September, and I think they're crazy. But if they're successful, then, when they're taking money down to the bank when they sell honey they made from those colonies, that's fine. One of the things that's really nice about making up those nukes is if you pull the old queen out of a colony and give that old colony a new queen, you've created a break in the brood cycle. And if you do that during a nectar flow, the bees that are producing the honey crop, they've already been produced. So you can have a gap. And this is kind of when Mother Nature does a lot of queen supersedure, so the old queens are being dismissed and the new queens are being produced through supersedure. And most beekeepers don't go into their colonies during the honey flow because they've been told not to. But you can, and you can take out some frames, a brood, you can take out frames of honey, make up a 2 frames of brood, a frame of honey, a couple of empty frames. You've got a new nuke, and then you're able to grow that operation. If you wait until the nectar flow is over, it's going to be more difficult. Some people in the southern states, they make up fall nukes. They do a very great job with that because they've got a late August, September, October flow from whatever it may be in their neighborhood, and they can build up. But you have to know your plants if you're going to do that in the spring and summer. And down there where you are, Shane, in North Carolina, I would think you'd be thinking about making up nukes in May or even earlier, depending on the season. They tell me that our seasons are now 3 weeks earlier than they were 25 years ago. When I'm looking at the snow falling, I don't always agree with that. But I think that we have a lot to learn about climate, and we're still learning it, so that if our flows start earlier, that should mean that our plants start earlier. That should mean that our bees will want to swarm earlier. And I see making up these nukes as a way of curing this issue of colonies who want to swarm. It's not 100%, but you certainly can cut a colony back and have strong colonies producing a crop of honey or doing the pollination work you want them to do, plus growing new colonies. You may have to do some feeding in the spring to get them there. And so if you're a laid-back beekeeper, you don't want to feed or you choose not to feed, that may not be your style, and that's fine. It's okay by me if you don't want to do that. But I like to get a little food out there, and both protein and sugar. I don't feed anything but sugar, sucrose, and I think that works great. Just does a great job of building up beehives. What you got?
In one of the oh, I'm sorry. No, I want to do this one first. When you're making when you're splitting a hive or making a nuke, and this is one of those questions that I think, depending on who you ask, you might get a different answer, but I'm wondering your take on it. When you split a hive, or let's say you want to requeen the hive and you pinch off the old queen, do you immediately install the new queen, or do you delay? You know, when I got into this industry, the guy that was mentoring me said you always wait 24 hours. I think I've changed my perspective on that a bit, but I'm wondering what you think.
Well, I think that it becomes a matter of pragmatics. If you have to drive 100 miles round trip to install a queen 24 hours later, it doesn't make sense to come back and make that trip, not at $4 a gallon gasoline.
But what about from the colony's perspective? Forget,
we're
we're doing what's best for the colony here, Larry, not what's best for us.
According to the research that I've seen, colonies detect a drop in their old queen's pheromone level within 15 minutes. So they know something's amiss. And I definitely don't agree with a few people that say you should leave the colony queenless for 3 or 4 days and then introduce a queen. By then they've invested time and energy into their own queen cells, assuming they have brood to work with. And they're going to be a little less accepting of that queen. So if I can't come back in a few hours and put a queen cell or a virgin queen or a mated queen into that colony, I'll do it right now. But then I want to have that cell or that virgin or mated queen, of course, in a cage where the bees cannot kill her, can't get at her and maul her. So that's one of the beauties of some of the introductory cages we see nowadays, the JZB cage in particular. There's a place there for the queen to hide where the bees can't reach her. And they can still feed the queen, but they can't tug at her feet and other things that, you know, we hear these horror stories about how bees can be nasty to their new management, new queen. So I think that if we can delay the introduction, you know, if you're setting up 3 or 4 nukes or 30 or 40 nukes, you get everything set up, and then you put that queen cell in, or that, if you're moving the bees to a new location, put the queen cell in after you've moved them. If you're using cages, either the Benton wood and screen cage or the JZBZ cage, then I'd be inclined to say put the queen in as I did in that slide when you're making it up. Just do it. Just get it over with. And if you're not moving the colony, that's the time to do it. And just remember, every time you open up a hive, there's more disruption. Every time you disrupt a hive, it's probably not a good thing for a new queen. All right?
Okay. Just for my own 2 cents on that, I always requeen immediately. I'll pinch her off and throw that new queen in. But like you said, in a cage, of course, not a direct release. And that really came about. We were doing some shooting of video, and it was actually an experiment, not a scientific one by any stretch, but we intentionally pinched off a queen the day before we were going to shoot the video, and it wasn't even 24 hours, and they already had queen cells being built in there with larvae, or eggs. Well, it was larvae. They were drawing out emergency cells basically within 24 hours, and so from my perspective, that affects the acceptance rate, I think. So I always requeen immediately.
I think you have a point there, yeah. Right. Good.
There's a couple questions here about splitting new hives. So some people either are getting nukes or packages, and so they're just getting started. What are your thoughts on that? Should you, if I were to install a package, should I split that hive?
I think we need to let that queen go at least 2 full cycles of brood. That's 2 3-week periods. Better yet, 3 cycles of brood before we think about taking anything away from those colonies, especially with packages and swarms. Now, swarms seem to have this remarkable reproductive ability. You know, some of Dr. Tom Seeley's work shows that a swarm of bees will produce most of the comb it's ever going to produce in the first 100 days. So let's take that 100 days and say, okay, well, let's use that as a benchmark. 3 months and in 10 days, we're going to go in and we're going to be able to pull out brood. Well, maybe before that, depending on your nectar flow. But don't be in a big hurry to pull out this brood. If you have to, if one of those queens that you have fails, yes, you can take brood out of the other colony. But to make the nuke up, let those colonies get established, get into the nectar flow, and they're strong enough now where they can give up a frame of bees and brood, or a frame of brood from one colony and a frame of bees from another, or 2 frames, depending on how strong it is, how strong you want the nuke, and how long you have to work with these bees. So, yeah, I don't want to get people out there splitting these packages the week after they get them installed, because that could be pretty negative. Did I answer it?
Yes. Do you, what about sort of inspection of these nukes? Are there any sort of considerations there? Do you inspect them more frequently, less frequently? Do you look for anything different in a nuke than what you're looking at in a full-size hive?
You have probably accelerated concerns with a nuke, so you may not inspect them more often. I don't know how often people are inspecting their regular colonies. In the spring, I'm inclined to say every 10 days to 14 days for colonies, for that build-up period, make sure everything's going well. And then you can kind of relax and start breathing once you get past swarm season. I'm always impressed with the number of beekeepers where their colonies swarm, and the beekeeper doesn't know it. They never see it. And if you're at work during the day and the bees leave and somebody reports, I saw your bees doing something funny the other day. You say, oh, no, my bees. I look at all the bees in here. Well, that's the whole point. A strong colony is the one that's more likely to swarm. With all the brood they've got emerging, they can quickly cover up the fact that 40 to 60% of the bees have left in a matter of just a couple of days. So during that time of the year, I'm inclined to make a few more visits if I can. Your schedule, your number of colonies. These are all things that come into play here. Giving them plenty of room during swarming season, of course, is important. Where am I going with this, Shane?
I'm not sure. We're talking about how often to inspect a nuke and if there's any sort of special considerations
so
versus a parent hive.
Once your nuke is going and you've got a queen installed in there, your biggest risk is that she's going to overgrow the size of that nuke box. And if you've got a 5-frame deep, you may want to think of taking out a frame of brood and bees and putting it in another nuke. Or you may want to use a second hive body, a nuke hive body to put on top. Or you may want to move that equipment into the nuke into 8 or 10 frame equipment and grow this colony. And especially if you start in the spring. So now your 2 and a half hives are going to become 3 or more colonies. And that's okay because you still can use that queen as a backup, replace all queens, whatever happens, because you have more assets involved here. You also have more equipment, which, I apologize, that's the curse of beekeeping. It's good news for people like Brushy Mountain, right? But it's not the best thing for your home budget when you're trying to convince the other half that you want to have a hive of bees. But I think it's a good move to watch these bees. And as I said just a few minutes ago, you can always add a frame of brood back to the colony that gave it up a month or two earlier and boost the bees up in that colony. So it can be a two-way street in terms of that equalization and whatever you're trying to do here. But by getting that nuke established and putting in a mite-resistant queen, you can upgrade the quality of your queens in the process. All right, I think that got it.
This is this is a interesting question. Why even bother? Why bother with nukes? Why not just use regular size boxes and effectively have 3 colonies? Because it seems that if you're making up these nukes fairly early in the season, there's a lot of attention that needs to be given. Do they have enough room? Is the queen outlaid her brood area? Are they becoming honey bound? Are they becoming pollen bound? And so they're becoming congested. And of course, that's more likely to occur on 5 frames versus 8 or 10 frames. So why not just say, okay, I want 2 hives, but I'm going to run this 3rd one as a replacement?
I think that's fine. And the 2 and a half idea just came out. Well, the 5-frame nuke box is a little bit cheaper than a regular 8 or 10 frame hive. If you have the equipment, I want you to look into what a follower board is. It's a dummy board in some people's vocabulary. It's usually just a sheet of plywood with a top bar on it that you can move to adjust to the size of the colony. So if you have an 8 or 10 frame box, you can make up your nuke in that 3 frames of bees and honey. And as that queen grows that colony, as those bees expand, you just move the follower board over, so you go from 3 frames to 5 frames to 7 frames to 10 frames. So these are all things you can use, and now you've got one size equipment. And I like to simplify in terms of the amount of equipment I have to have on hand or whatever. You also are in a situation now where it's going to be easier to combine those hives if you decide to combine them with a newspaper because the old queen in one of those 2 original colonies is conked out. And you can't find her. She's too late for her to come back from the mating flight she should have returned from last month. So these are things that you can do with that. So I think it's fine to use that regular size equipment. But you have to confine the bees to a smaller area with that follower board or some sort of device like that. Did I make that clear enough?
I think so, yes.
Good.
What about pest management in a nuke? Should you medicate for varroa, for nosema? Are there any special considerations there when dealing with pests, a nuke versus a full-size colony?
I'm not the best person to talk about pest management because I'm trying to, keep our bees basically chemical free, with a few exceptions. I think if you are going to do anything with, say, grower control and nosema control, you should be doing on the basis of you have looked to see what the population of both of those organisms. How many mites do you have in a sample if you do a sugar shake or a ether roll or a soapy water bath with 300 bees in a jar, pour it out onto through hardware cloth so you can see how many mites come out. That's a simple thing you can do, and try to figure out what that means for your bees. That if you have 3 mites on 300 bees on the first week of July, what's that mean to you? I can't tell you. It might mean you're fine, but if you had 40, that doesn't sound as good. If you had 100, it's starting to get a little crowded in there. Too many mites. So you have to start making decisions about when your treatment would be necessary. The second thing is, what are you going to treat with? And I'm not making recommendations because there are just too many things out there and it gets too complicated. I would like to see everybody use mite-resistant stock and something like the powdered sugar treatments, but we're a long way from doing that as long as we have commercial beekeepers who have to move bees to almonds every year. It just changes everything for everybody.
Okay. We've talked, well, actually, let me elaborate on that first. In one of the slides, there was a frame that was labeled drone. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, we try to produce drones for our breeding program, and some people use drones for mite elimination. We don't. We try to produce drones for their intended purpose. That's to mate with queens. But you can use those drones in either in a comb with the foundation that's got drone size cells in it. We use both the the Pureco and the Natural Comb drone foundation from Dadant. We put sometimes not on purpose, we put a medium frame in a deep box, and so they build drone comb at the bottom, and that can either be cut off or used for drone mating. But I'm just going to repeat what I said earlier. In August, we had no drones at all. And the queens that were trying to get out there and mate were coming back unmated. So this is against what I would instinctively think would be happening here in Michigan during the summer.
Okay. We've talked a little bit about feeding. Can you elaborate a bit more on how you feed these nukes if necessary, and also your thoughts on fondant or sugar or candy boards? What are your thoughts on those, and what do you think is the best way to feed?
There were a couple of slides there that showed jars on top of the hives. I think that first slide I showed. And those jars are actually there because we use the Boardman feeder, the entrance feeder, to put water in those hives from the 1st of June until the end of August. And they take down a couple of quarts a week. So we figured that, helps the bees. They've got clean water. They're not getting into anything with pesticide in it. And I like to think they're not going to the neighbor's swimming pool, but I'm sure they're still going there too. But we don't use that for sugar feeding. I like to either use jars inside the hive in an empty shell, even if I have to take a couple of frames out to feed. If I've got a 5-frame nuke, it's probably going to have 1 or 2 jars of thin sugar syrup, that's 1 to 1, 1 part sugar, 1 part water, and in a shell on top of the hive so that it's completely enclosed. With nukes, it's really hard to use a liquid sugar and get away from the robbing issue. So for that reason, you may be better off using one of the fondants. These, sugar mixtures that you can make up or you can buy now and put right on the hive and use a small amount, watch how fast they take it down, And I think that's the way we're headed, and that's using more of the fondant or the granulated sugar patties.
Excellent. Larry, we've reached the top of the hour, and whenever I have guest speakers, I always try to hold true to the time slot that we've got, which was an hour. So I'd like to wrap
you
this.
got one good question there, or are we?
Have I got one? You want one more? I'm willing. One good question. Let me scroll down here real quick and see what we've got.
Apparently not.
Well, honestly there's quite a few questions that have gone unanswered, and so I'm trying to find that really good question amongst all of these very good questions. And I think the one I'm gonna settle on is because and I'm doing this partially out of my own self-interest. Urban beekeeping's on the rise, and while this isn't necessarily directly related to our talk tonight, urban beekeeping's on the rise. Swarm control is a huge issue, but also in these urban settings, having too many hives may actually be restricted. You may be restricted to the number of hives which you can have on a particular lot. And so what's the best method of swarm control? Obviously, if we were to take these two hives right here that we see now and split them to make up a nuke, that may help. But maybe that's against the local ordinances because you're only allowed 2 hives, and the hive police would say you've got 3 now. How can someone in that situation alleviate that swarming tendency?
Well, one of the it's not a sneaky way. I want people to explore the opportunities of a 2-queen operation. So where you have the queen excluder on both of these hives, you put in a screen, a double screen with a back entrance. So you could have 2 queens laying there. So you could, make your split in a vertical method rather than putting it in another box. There actually is a nuke behind that one colony, the shorter one. So you could have one stack of boxes with 2 or 3, 2 queens in each one. The downside of that, of course, is when there's a honey flow on, they can get pretty darn tall, and you better have some help moving full boxes of honey on and off so that you can manipulate. There's an old system back when I was at Ohio State University called the modified 2-queen system that I believe it was Winston Dunham developed in the 1920s and 30s. And he actually do a 2-queen system, and as the clover flow started there in central Ohio, he would pull out the double screen and combine the 2 brood nests. So you have the bees from 2 queens producing one big honey crop. And it's a little more labor intensive, but it does provide the urban beekeeper with a way of having more bees, no swarms, and of course by the splitting you're going to hopefully minimize that swarming instinct, and a big crop. So you're getting what you want. I just like to caution everybody that is an urban beekeeper, and I need to look in a mirror right now and say, okay, you have to go to the neighbors and be really generous with that honey. So that, you buy them off, I guess, or sweeten the deal, depending on your point of view here. So that's kind of where I'm at on the urban beekeeping. I think urban beekeepers are phenomenal. I'm always amazed with what they do and how well they could stretch the way they count. And he says, well, that's not really a full colony. It's a nuke. How many nukes, can you equate to a colony? So biologically, there's probably a way of doing that. So just be careful with that. And again, back to my Ohio days, there was a beekeeper at one of the cities in Ohio. And this fellow had about 60 colonies in a quarter-acre lot. And he had more colonies there than he needed, but he was an older gentleman. He was a first-generation immigrant, And he simply did not understand that he couldn't keep that many colonies in his backyard because that's what he had done back on the homeland. And, you know, we have to be a little more progressive there because we can't have all those bees relieving themselves on the neighbor's, you know, Mercedes.
All right.
Your neighbors have Mercedes, right? My neighbors have beater trucks, so right at home here.
Well, Larry, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your knowledge. It's always a pleasure, and we look forward to next time. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure here, and we'll see everybody in a month.
All right. Everyone, have a good night. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Bye.